Says you are. How about now?
Okay.
Okay.
Can you see it now?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry about that. You're
Okay.
good.
Okay, good. Thank you, Don. It sounds like we now have video and the slides. Let me just back up. This was Harry Truman on the farm, 1910. You see horse-drawn plow. He enlists in 1917 in the American Expeditionary Force in the U.S. Army. And this is one of the things that will change his life. This is the first time he's outside of his rural community in near Independence, Missouri. This is something he will be sent to France. He will discover. By the way, he's 33 years old now. He could have not gone because of his age, but he volunteered, and he found that he rose to artillery captain very quickly. He was captain of Battery D, as in Destiny, made up primarily of Missouri boys, made up primarily of people who were who were of Irish ancestry, as a matter of fact. But he actually knew some of the people who were in his battery. He actually did take part in combat. Lieutenant and then Captain Truman saw action in the Meuse-Argonne offensive, which was at that time the largest American military action in our nation's history. He was part of a massive 600,000 men who were moved up to the front, and they got ready for the large Meuse-Argonne offensive. A swashbuckling U.S. tank commander by the name of Harry Truman, by the name of George Patton, Lieutenant Colonel George Patton, would write his wife on the eve of the offensive, quote, "Just a word to you before I leave to play a part in what promises to be the biggest battle of the war or the world so far." The bombardment, and again, Truman's battery is part of this, began before daylight, September 26, 1918. And what I thought was interesting was almost 3,000 guns opened fire all along the front in France, with such a roar that maybe the world had never heard before. One of the American pilots, Captain Eddie Rickenbacker himself, would say later, "Through the darkness, the whole western horizon was illuminated with one mass of jagged flashes." The offensive in which Harry Truman's battery took place, would last 3 hours. And think of this, more ammunition was expended during those 3 hours in France than in the entire American Civil War. More ammunition in 3 hours than were expended in the entire Civil War. From Hill 290, it looked as if the sky was on fire. That's where Battery D was. And Captain Truman would later say it was as though every gun in France was turned loose. Now a legitimate war hero and someone who had seen Europe and actually seen Paris, Harry Truman is discharged after the war and returns back to Missouri. This is maybe part of his early life that people do know, which was he went into the men's clothing business. Eddie Jacobson, I don't know if my cursor is working, but the fellow on the left is Harry Truman, looking dapper to the left there on your screen. This Eddie Jacobson, and who had been one of his had been in one of the other batteries in the offensive and was they'd become acquainted in Europe and on their way back to America. Eddie Jacobson and Harry Truman decided that they were going to go into business together. They didn't know exactly what they wanted to do, but Harry knew one thing for sure: he was not going to go back to the farm. Something he would not tell voters, but he actually hated farming. And it was, of course, think about it, it was a back-breaking life back then. And so instead, they gathered what reserves they could. They borrowed money. They leased a store in Kansas City, downtown Kansas City, and it opened as Truman and Jacobson Men's Clothing. Their target was upscale men's clothing, accessories, belts, cufflinks, shirts, that sort of thing. Now, why did they do that? Well, it's not quite clear. Harry Truman had no retail experience, no real merchandising experience. Eddie had some, but of course he had bought and sold supplies and equipment and animals as a farmer. That was about the extent of it. But, and I think it'd be fair to say that under any interpretation, it was sort of an impulsive thing for Truman to do, but he thought he could do it. He also wanted to get married. And a month after Truman and Jacobson opens in Kansas City, June 28th, 1919. June 28th is an important day because it's also Pat's birthday. Harry Truman was married to Bess Wallace, Wallace. Harry and Bess, by the way, had gone to high school together. He had known her for a long time. They'd had sort of a long distance romance for many years. And then again, now co-owner of a retail store, Harry Truman and Bess, June 1919, are married. This is Harry and Bess on their wedding day. Harry Truman, by the way, is not young. He's already in his 30s now. And the story goes that Mrs. Wallace, Bess's mother, thought she could do better. She was disappointed that he didn't, her daughter, who was very popular, did not marry someone of more secure financial, with a more secure financial future. But they married. The story itself was a failure. We, as typically happens, entered an economic downturn after the war, and this was not a good time to be starting a retail business. So Truman and Jacobson had an initial success and then rapidly began to fail. By 1922, they were on the edge of bankruptcy, Jacobson and Truman. Now, lore has it, by the way, and this is important in the evolution of Truman's career, lore has it that Truman filed for bankruptcy when the store went under. In reality, he didn't. Eddie Jacobson would file for bankruptcy later, but Truman was very concerned about keeping up appearances and his future. He did not want to be seen as a failure. So he never did file for bankruptcy, and instead he paid off his creditors over a period of years. But eventually he did pay off everyone to whom Truman and Jacobson owed money. It took him, by the way, 15 years. So think of this, we're into 1937. By then, Truman will be in Washington and he's still paying off creditors from his failed business adventure way back in the early 1920s. This, by the way, also would very much restrict his Harry and Bess's freedom of movement, and that money was always an issue. Into this, excuse me. Into this now comes one of the most important players in Truman's political life, and that is the leadership of the Pendergast machine, Pendergast, Pendergast. This is one of the early political machines and the first political machine, boss ward politics in Kansas City. This is the actual first Pendergast. This is Jim Pendergast, late in the 19th century, with his big walrus. He was a large man, Irishman, Catholic, big man who apparently had a gregarious personality by all accounts. And Jim Pendergast was also a saloon keeper, good place to meet people, and something of a political wizard. He made himself boss of the first Democratic machines, and he's famous or infamous for a lot of his quotations. One that I like is he once said, Becky said this many times, "I've got friends, and by the way, that's all there is in this boss business, friends." Just happened to have friends, many of whom were fellow saloon owners and such. Big Jim, as they called him, was hardworking, hard drinking, but he again had a political knack, and he kept expanding the base of his political machine in Kansas City, and increasing his coalition. He himself didn't have much in the way of ambitions for public office. He wanted to be the political power behind the scenes. He didn't want to be mayor of Kansas City. He wanted to pick and control the mayor of Kansas City, for example. And he was good at broadening his base. Into the beginning of the 20th century, Big Jim formed a coalition of not just Irish Americans, but African Americans, Poles, Slavs, Croatian Americans, who were heavily represented in the slaughterhouses in Kansas City, nearly every immigrant group. And the largest immigrant group besides the Irish Americans that became part of the Pendergast operation, Pendergast machine, were Italian Americans. With the beginning of the turn of the century, the first decade of the 20th century, Big Jim now was ready to pass the torch to his son, who, by the way, was 17 years his junior. So this is a generational change as well. And here he is, one of the most important people in Harry Truman's life, as it would turn out. This is Tom Pendergast, Thomas Joseph Pendergast. TJ, a lot of people called him. Others simply, like Harry Truman, would call him the boss. And this is a man who, after 1915, never held public office himself. Again, like his father, he ruled from behind the scenes. And he also built, through ways that were legal and illegal, he also built a fortune and continued control of a series of saloons. He had life and death control over some 600 saloons in Kansas City and beyond at his height. and through a series of companies. One of his largest was the Ready Mixed Concrete Company. Now, why is that important? Well, it seemed that the city and the county, they're in Clark County, Missouri, always was building roads, always was maintaining roads, always was building new public offices for officials, city and county government. And if you control the largest concrete company, you also in time control the largest construction companies, and one hand would help the other. I think you get what I'm saying. Again, was Tom Pendergast outside the law? Of course he was. But he was also, like his father, highly intelligent, very clever, and for all of his criminal side, he was a very affable person. Pendergast was not one to wax philosophical about his political philosophy. One of his famous quotes, which tells you, I think, everything you need to know about Pendergast, is he once said, "Politics is a business, and all the year-round competitive business. To the victor belong the spoils." I might as well be honest about it. It may be cynical, but that's a fact. It's the same locally and nationally. Nobody gets a job or an appointment because he's a nice fellow. He must deserve it politically. It's the same as in any other business. You may be thinking of The Godfather. It's not personal, it's just business. If Tom Pendergast was the big boss, and he was, and would remain so into 1940, his younger brother, Michael, was the what they call the enforcer of loyalty. And Michael had a son, Jim, named after his grandfather, who also would become over time the heir apparent. Again, Jim Pendergast will pass it on to this man, Tom Pendergast, who in turn, for years and years, is grooming Jim to be his heir apparent. He's actually Tom Pendergast's son-in-law. He was Michael's son. Jim Pendergast, here he is. This is the boss, Pendergast, Tom Pendergast. This is 1939. This is Jim Pendergast, his son-in-law, heir apparent. Pleasant looking, pleasant mannered fellow who had got to know Harry Truman in the war. That they actually, while they were both from the Kansas City, Independence, Missouri area, they actually became best acquainted overseas in France, and remained friends forever. In fact, while his name is forgotten today, Jim Pendergast is one of the most, along with Tom, is one of the most important reasons Harry Truman ever got to high public office. One day in 1921, early 22, we think it was the fall of 21, Jim Pendergast, the fellow on the right, brings his father around to the Kansas City haberdashery to meet his wartime buddy, Harry Truman. And this, by the way, is an ad for Truman Jacobson. They're in Kansas City, haberdashers. And it was clear to Truman by then that while the business had not failed, it was failing, and that they probably didn't have. He was got to look for a new occupation, a new job before long, as well as begin to pay off his debts. Well, to his surprise, Jim, who knew that Harry was in financial difficulty, had persuaded his father and his uncle that they should run Harry for judge of Jackson County. Now, a judge is not a judicial position in Missouri in those days. A judge is like a county commissioner. It's not judicial, it's administrative. And they wanted Harry, there were 3 judges who ran Clark County. The Eastern judge was essentially represented the rural parts of Clark County, including Independence. The Western judge essentially represented Kansas City, Missouri. And then you had a 3rd judge who was the senior administrative officer, if you will. And 2 out of 3 votes of those judges didn't get anything done. Harry Truman immediately recognized the opportunity. He also knew that he would need work soon and income soon. So he accepted. In fact, he accepted pretty much on the spot. This was a political plum. Think of it this way: in a city and state increasingly controlled by boss politics, by machine politics, the county judges in Clark County, which included the center of the Pendergast Empire, the county judges hired and controlled all county employees. They hired and fired anyone who did work for the county. They determined who was awarded county contracts. And in a world where there was always public works to be done, and later the onset of the Great Depression, a county judge was a powerful position in Missouri in those days. So Harry Truman runs in 1922 for Clark County judge for the Eastern District. This is the earliest political button known to exist in Harry's political career. And again, I want to emphasize, he's still a long way from national prominence, much less the vice presidency or the presidency. He is, and he's 37 years old. He's 37 years old, running for his first political office. At his speech, opening his first campaign, the Battery D Irish bunch, as they called themselves, veterans who had served under Harry and Battery D in France, came out in force. And in fact, the Battery D bunch would be part of all of Harry's Missouri campaigns. And of course, there was a representation of Tom Pendergast's people there as well. This is, again, I think fascinating. Early flyer, Harry Truman's first campaign for public office. Harry S. Truman for a judge of the Eastern District. This is actually before the primary. He had to win a primary, although he had the backing that counted. And a couple of things about this. One, notice the platform: good roads, a budgeted road fund, economy, a day's work for a day's pay, fewer automobiles. I guess there was people were irritated with cars in rural areas, congesting the streets, and more work for county employees. The other thing about this that's interesting is, notice it's Harry S. Truman. Does anyone know what the S stands for in Harry S. Truman? Well, I'll tell you. I see Don shaking his head. It stands for S. He didn't have a middle name. And if you look at Harry's signatures throughout his life, it's Harry S. no period Truman. Even though on his first flyer, you see that they put an S after his name. That was actually incorrect. And but nobody cared. And Harry S. Truman, again, sounded more dignified or official or whatever they thought at the time. Something unusual happened. Harry won, needless to say, backed by the Pendergast machine. Harry won the primary, won the general election with no difficulty. Now enters public office in 1923. And this is where this, again, another side of Truman begins to emerge. The one of the local newspapers, the Independence Examiner, Independence, Missouri, very early in Harry's career as Judge Truman, would write this: no criticism or scandals of any importance have been brought with the county court as a center, and no political charges of graft and corruption have been made against it. In short, something unusual is happening in Clark County. And Truman, in fact, was the oddity. He by all accounts, was very able, took his job very seriously. Much like a farmer, got up early, was at the office early, worked hard, traveled extensively, meeting constituents, answered his mail, and before long, he was the driving force of the Clark County judgeship. Truman also would continue to be reelected up until the end of 1934. So he's a judge for a dozen years. And during the last 8 of those years, he is the senior judge. He is the judge who essentially runs the operation. Courthouses are built, city government is built. People come to Harry looking for work, and especially when the Depression comes, Harry Truman becomes a very important person to many people of Clark County, and is again the anomaly. He seems to be honest. He does not get rich and he could have taking kickbacks from contractors and that sort of thing. Now, why, by the way, why would Tom Pendergast, why would he tolerate this? Who needs an honest man in the judgeship? Well, Pendergast already was having his issues with law enforcement, and they decided, having somebody out there kind of in the front of the county who, there is no scandal. There are no whispers about womanizing or taking money under the table. It's good for our image. We can still go about what we always do. And Harry's part of the Pendergast operation. He's not going to say anything, but he personally looks good. He shows well to the public. We can always say, hey, we're not all crooks. Look at Harry. He's an honest man. He's a veteran. He's been a farmer. He's got a wife and daughter, and very active in civic affairs as well as his political office. So again, in some ways, he becomes the legitimate window dressing for the Pendergast machine. Now, 1934 is a critical year, because now Truman's tenure as a Clark County judge is coming to an end. The position is term limited, and now he's not going to be able to run for re-election. And without being a judge, he doesn't really have a clear political future. No one knows, including Harry Truman, if there's another position for him or not in another public office. And he's worried. He's also, in 1934, he's also 50 years old. He's not a kid. And unlike other people you could think of over years in public office, he didn't have a law practice to go back to. He wasn't a lawyer. He didn't have an insurance business, or his own family business to go back to. It was the Depression. The family farm was not doing well. Plus, Harry did not want to be a farmer again. He had no personal income. He had not taken money. He was not rich. And in fact, in 34, Harry Truman, Judge Truman writes his nephew, and he tells his nephew, it'll be better for you to go to work for a bank or some mercantile institution and get real experience than to get a political job where you learn nothing and you lose out when the administration and power changes. Again, he knew the ups and downs of making your career public life or in politics. This, by the way, is a picture of Truman in 33 or 34. This is when he's the senior judge in Clark County. He's actually signing checks to city employees' wages. And you see him at his desk being diligent. Harry also knew where his bread was buttered. And as he said privately to Bess, everything will work out all right, I think, quote, as long as the big boss believes in me. Tom Pendergast on the right, young Harry Truman about this time, around 34 on the left. Now, this is also the zenith of the political power of Tom Pendergast. Again, Prohibition had been very, very good to him. This political cartoon in the Kansas City Star shows Pendergast in the late 20s into the beginning of the 30s. He controlled, I think I told you, in one way or another, 200 saloons. He not only named who was mayor of Kansas City, but also now he had the power to pick and name who was going to be governor, much less a county judge. Tom Pendergast, by the way, one reason that he prospered so well without any problem from authorities in the bootlegging business was because the county liquor commissioner, the person who was in charge of watching over the business, making sure licenses were properly awarded, that person was Tom's brother, Michael. Worked out pretty well. Kansas City was a roaring, growing, and corrupt town by this time. And in addition to liquor, bootlegging, also thriving under Pendergast was gambling, prostitution, narcotics, racketeering, and it was all out in the open. I mean, there was this was a wide open town, and you think it's Chicago? Well, Kansas City was, and this is Kansas City, Missouri, wasn't much different. In fact, maybe not different at all. By 33, 34, Kansas City had 40 dance halls and over 100 nightclubs. And there were civic reformers, people who wanted to clean up Kansas City, but they got crushed in the elections every 2 years. This is kind of how Tom Pendergast critics saw him. This is, I think, also is the Kansas City Star. There is a reign of terror in Kansas City. This is again, early 1930s political cartoon, not what you would call flattering. By the way, and this is also typical and often in urban areas where they're wide open, there are some other sides. There's the Kansas City Monarchs baseball team that's renowned. There's also with some of the greatest jazz you'll ever want to hear. in Kansas City. People like Count Basie and his Kansas City Seven that were thriving and packing them in Kansas City during the Pendergast years. And if you think of the song, Kansas City, here I come. Well, this is the Kansas City of Tom Pendergast. And it, along with everything else, it was a mecca for jazz musicians, often African-American Black musicians who thrived in the atmosphere and the popularity they achieved in places like Kansas City. In May of 1934, again, Harry Truman, 50 years old, not knowing his political future or if he had one, without warning, everything again changes for him. Harry thought, he had entertained and talked to some the Pendergast people that maybe he should run for the House of Representatives in Congress. Maybe he should run for Congress. But Tom Pendergast already had somebody else lined up for the upcoming open position in Congress. So that was out of the realm of possibility. Then he had a call from his good friend Jim Pendergast. Again, here's Jim, another picture from the 30s with his uncle Tom Pendergast, and Jim wanted to meet. And when they met, Jim Pendergast, on behalf of Tom, made an offer. I could say made an offer he couldn't refuse. He made Harry Truman an offer, Judge Truman an offer that he was incredulous. He was almost speechless. But he was told by Jim that Tom Pendergast wanted Harry to run for the United States Senate. Again, Truman had thought about maybe going to Washington as a House member. Running for the Senate was well beyond anything he could have imagined. Although, again, he promptly accepted. It's interesting also that Tom Pendergast is, the Harry Truman is not Tom Pendergast's first choice to be the Democratic nominee for the US Senate. In fact, he's not his second choice or his third choice or even his fourth choice. He had tried to get other better known people to run, and for one reason or another, they all begged off. He finally, at Jim Pendergast's suggestion, settled on Harry Truman, who announced for the US Senate against two other sitting congressmen, Democratic congressmen, on May 24th of 1934. You see here, again, one of the very early flyers or posters. Like every other Democrat, he's running on FDR's coattails, our popularity, a winner for the New Deal, Harry S. Truman. They still have a period there, even though there is no period in S. From Independence, Missouri, make him the Democratic nominee for US Senate, August 7th, 1934, is primary election day. None of what we would call political pundits, none had seen this coming. When you see speculation in newspapers about Democrats who might run for the US Senate, Judge Truman's name never was on the list. And when he announced, he was thought to be a remote possibility for the Senate. Truman wrote in his diary at this time, today, this is 4 a.m., I have to make the most momentous announcement of my life. I have come to the place where all men strive to be at my age, and I thought 2 weeks ago that retirement on a virtual pension in some minor county office was all that was in store for me. So again, Harry Truman was as surprised as anybody that he now found himself running for the US Senate. Again, he's running against two well-known congressmen, and to make matters worse, the other Senate seat in Missouri, the senior senator from Missouri, also a Democrat, is totally against Truman running. In fact, he's broken with the Pendergast machine, and his name is Bennett Clark, C-L-A-R-K. If you know who Champ Clark was, this is his son, Bennett Clark, U.S. Senator, an opponent of the Pendergast organization. His base, Senator Clark's base, is not in Kansas City. His political power base is in St. Louis. But that's always, when you want to get elected statewide in those days, you have the votes, 2/3 of the votes are either Kansas City or St. Louis, and the other third are in the rural areas. I'll give you a flavor for what Senator Clark at this time thought of Harry Truman, Judge Truman, running for the Senate. Quote, "It seems my old," this is a speech he gave, "it seems my old friend, Judge Harry S. Truman, finds it easier to abuse me than to set forth his own qualifications. His opening speech at Columbia, which was attended almost exclusively by a mob from Kansas City. In fact, I am informed the natives looked over the crowd to see if Dillinger was there." John Dillinger, "by a lot of state employees who were ordered out by their superiors as a condition to holding their jobs to be at the rally, and they herded over in buses like trucks carrying cattle to market." Again, very trying to very much denigrate Truman as just a stooge for the Pendergast machine. I got to tell you, by the way, politics, strange bedfellows. Senator Clark all out to defeat Harry Truman in his first try for the U.S. Senate. Clark himself will go on a decade later in 1944 to be defeated for re-election to I think it was a third term. And so he will be out of work. And in 1945, former Senator Bennett Clark will be appointed to the U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals in Washington, D.C. Who's the president who appoints him? Harry Truman. Interesting. On the day of the primary, August the 7th, 1934, excuse me. And this is Harry and Bess on election day, August 1934. Truman wins. It's a three-way primary. The two more heavier duty candidates, the two congressmen, split the vote, allowing Harry to squeak in a three-way race. He won by 40,000 votes, not bad. And the difference was, guess what? Jackson County, the center of the Pendergast organization, where Harry had been judge for 12 years. He carried Jackson County by 137,000 votes. Now he carried the state by 40,000. So you can see where his now emerging political power base was. The Kansas City Star referred to it as a Pendergast triumph, pure and simple. And the St. Louis Post-Dispatch said that Judge Truman's primary election victory to the Senate nomination was, quote, without significance. One of the worst predictions, I guess, ever. Preparing to leave for office, Harry did, this is not Harry Truman, but this is Tom Pendergast talking to our persuading a constituent. Preferring to leave for Washington, Senator-elect Truman called on boss Pendergast, and the advice that Tom Pendergast gave him was, when you get to Washington, quote, work hard, keep your mouth shut, and answer your mail. So when he was sworn in January 3rd, 1935, as a U.S. Senator, watching with pride from the Senate balcony were his wife, Bess, his daughter, Margaret, and his good friend, Jim Pendergast. Again, Jim, his old war buddy, had played such a crucial role in even being a candidate for the U.S. Senate. It's interesting to look at Harry Truman, Senator Truman's now reaction from his colleagues and how it will dramatically change over the years. When he got there, the newspapers and some of his colleagues referred to him not as the senator from Missouri, but the senator from Pendergast. George Norris, Senator George Norris, Norris of Nebraska, long seen as one of the great voices of reform in the U.S. Senate, called Harry Truman, quote, poison, and refused to speak to him, refused to speak to his own colleague. This is Harry Truman with Tom Pendergast, by the way, at the 1936 Democratic National Convention. Not surprisingly, Tom Pendergast delivered votes not only for his proteges, but he also delivered votes for President Roosevelt. And this is a close-up. If you saw the wider version of this picture, they're talking to Jim Farley, the Postmaster General and the former campaign chairman for Franklin D. Roosevelt. Others like Ham Lewis, Senator Ham, H-A-M Lewis, L-E-W-I-S of Illinois, were kinder. Ham Lewis was in his 70s. He'd been in the Senate forever. He was the majority whip, number 2 in leadership in the Senate. And he sat down next to Truman during those early weeks in the Senate on the floor one day, and he said, quote, Harry, don't start out with an inferiority complex. For the first 6 months, you'll wonder how the hell you got here. And after that, you'll wonder how the hell the rest of us got here. Still, Harry Truman would make some unwise choices. He was a very diligent member from the very beginning, but in the reception area of his Senate office, over the marble mantelpiece, where no one could possibly miss it, Truman had a framed portrait of Tom Pendergast. April 4th, 1939, changed again, another great turning point in Truman's career. April 4th, 39, J. Edgar Hoover himself arrives in Kansas City. 3 months later, he announces that the Department of Justice has gone to a grand jury, and the grand jury's indicting Tom Pendergast for income tax evasion. Senator Truman was asked by reporters for his reaction. He said, quote, I'm sorry to hear it. I know nothing about the details. Tom Pendergast has always been my friend, and I don't desert a sinking ship. 3 days later, Tom Pendergast pleads guilty. This is a clip from a newspaper. I don't know where you can see it. Pendergast and O'Malley released by indictment of, or something by indictment of the Department of Justice. Anyway, Tom Pendergast pleaded guilty. May of 1939. He admitted that he had not reported some $830,000 that he owed the Internal Revenue Service. That was real money back in those days. And he would spend the next 15 months in Leavenworth in the federal penitentiary. Again, as the Pendergast machine is going down, and this will be pretty close to the end of the Pendergast machine. Again, you see in the Kansas City Star or the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, I forget which, Pendergast and it with legislators in his pocket, organized crime, part of his machine, voting fraud, owning the police, owning the gambling rackets, flailing as he's going down. Very evocative political cartoon. Several other members of the Pendergast machine went to prison as well. One, rather than go to prison, committed suicide, but not Harry Truman. Even the prosecutor, who in effect put Tom Pendergast in Leavenworth, even he would say, we looked into it and he's clean. Senator Truman is hasn't personally taken kickbacks or done any of these other things. In a letter to Bess, Senator Truman wrote, "It looks like everybody got rich in Jackson County but me." And that seems to have been the case. But as bad as this period of Harry Truman's political life was, and by the way, in the meantime, he was, again, he showed up at 7 o'clock in the morning at his Senate office, and he was very attentive to constituent requests. He was diligent in his committee work. Slowly but surely, he was gaining the respect of his Senate colleagues. He also, in these days, was known for being pretty effective at working across the aisle. He had Republican friends as well as Democratic friends in the Senate, and people began to take him more seriously. Still in all, this is not, by 39, this is not a good political time for Harry Truman, and he's got to face re-election in 1940. And this brings me to the next phase and second to last most important phase of what I want to tell you today about Harry Truman. Again, he faces re-election in 1940. His political patron is in Leavenworth. He is his political career hangs by a thread, and to make matters worse, he's going to have a dynamo opponent in the Democratic primary in 1940 for the U.S. Senate. This man is forgotten today, but his name is Lloyd C. Stark, S-T-A-R-K. And in 1936, he was elected governor of Missouri. Now, his path is different from Truman's. He wins the governorship with the backing in 36 of Tom Pendergast. He then proceeds to turn on Pendergast in 38, 39, and is very supportive of his indictment, conviction, and severs all, at least all public ties, wants to be seen now as someone who is a Pendergast critic, not an acolyte. And he runs in 1940, not for re-election as governor, but he runs for the United States Senate in the Democratic primary against Senator Truman. This is a man, Lloyd Stark, who has great political ambitions. Life magazine actually did a 6-page spread on the meteoric rise of Governor Lloyd Stark of Missouri in April of 1939. And in the Life magazine article, which of course was read across the country, Life termed Governor Stark the Democratic version of New York's racket buster, who was also on the political rise, Thomas E. Dewey. The major result, said Life magazine, of Pendergast's fall and imprisonment was, quote, to catapult honest, efficient Lloyd Stark, who's an apple grower by profession, right into the presidential ring. Well, Governor Stark liked that. In fact, he did have presidential ambitions. And after just 4 years, not quite 4 as governor, and he thought the stepping stone to be president was to become a US senator. So in September 1939, Governor Stark announces he's running for the Senate against Truman in the primary. Pivotal moment in Harry Truman's career. It could have ended right here. There's somebody else who wants to run for election or re-election in 1940, and that's the presidency, and that's Franklin Roosevelt. And what does FDR do when Senator Truman is now faced with a primary from Governor Stark? Well, Harry Truman had been among the most loyal supporters of the New Deal in his first term in the Senate. For over 5 years, he'd been vocally and in his votes a big supporter of the New Deal, very much of a Roosevelt Democrat. What does FDR do when he sees this primary looming? He does nothing. He does not endorse Truman for re-election. He doesn't endorse Governor Stark either, but he lets it be known in a roundabout fashion that if Senator Truman wanted to drop his re-election campaign, he would appoint him as chairman of the Interstate Commerce Commission. From senator to chairman of the Interstate Commerce Commission. Harry's response, tell him to go to hell, meaning tell FDR to go to hell. And he made it clear to anyone that if he couldn't come back to Washington or remain in Washington as a senator, he wasn't going to remain in Washington at all. Again, Tom Pendergast is in prison. The Kansas City political organization is in shambles. And now his president, someone he had loyally backed, President Roosevelt, is not supporting Harry Truman for re-election to the US Senate. The best that Truman can really hope was that FDR would remain neutral, which is essentially what he did. In Washington, D.C., the political columnist and muckraker Drew Pearson, who wrote a almost daily political column for the Washington Star, wrote that the wise boys were writing off Truman's chances for his second term. This is Harry Truman speaking, and he's running in the primary in 1940 against Stark. And even though if any Democrat, any New Deal Democrat had a reason to really detest Franklin Roosevelt, it was probably Harry Truman. But he didn't speak of it, at least not publicly. And publicly, he was a loyal Democrat, with one exception, by the way. When he announced formally that he was taking a second term in the US Senate early in 1940, Truman also said that he was opposed to FDR seeking a third term. How about that? No third term for Roosevelt, no fourth term for Roosevelt, no Vice President Truman. But he did say and he was sincere about it, that no man should serve more than 2 terms. And he used the analogy that 2 terms were good enough for Washington, they're good enough for Roosevelt. He also said that if FDR did run and was the nominee, he would certainly support him, but that he hoped he would not seek a third term. The Kansas City Journal-Post, which was anti-Pendergast, and said that his chances, Truman's chances for renomination and re-election in 1940 were, quote, nil, as in not at all. His campaign was low on money, very low on money. The campaign contributions were not coming in, while the money was rolling in for Governor Stark in his Senate bid. It was a wash in campaign contributions, given the time and the times. The widespread rumor in Missouri politics was that FDR's people were quietly trying to persuade Harry Truman to drop out of the race, but that he was having none of it. His family, Bess, Margaret, his longtime close friends like Jim Pendergast, they were very concerned about Harry Truman in 1940. Privately, they had never seen him so depressed. He was in despair over FDR's lack of support, Pendergast being in prison, of course, and increasingly he was concerned about the state of the world. Remember, September 1939, Nazi Germany invades Poland. Harry Truman is running for re-election when the war in Europe has already started. And again, you begin to see a side of Truman that's more admirable. The popular thing to do would have been to be a non-interventionist, an isolationist, such as Senator Burton Wheeler or Senator William Borah of Idaho, or one of the most outspoken isolationists, do not get involved in European affairs, was the senior senator from Missouri, Bennett Clark. So it would have been very easy for Truman to have followed along and oppose FDR and oppose any support for England and France. He did the opposite. In October of 1939, at great political risk, he said in the speech that Stalin, Hitler, and Mussolini had reverted to the code of, quote, caveman savagery. He said American neutrality was now obsolete in the race, and that the reality of the war in Europe meant that the Neutrality Act of 36, which he had voted for, was a mistake. He regretted having done that, and he now called for a repeal of the arms embargo. Or as Harry Truman put it in late 39 in a speech, I am of the opinion that we should not help the thugs among nations by refusing to sell arms to our friends. One of the people who was impressed by Truman's stance was Jimmy Burns, the senator from South Carolina, and of course, very close to FDR. And with Jimmy Burns, Truman gave a series of speeches in which he urged larger appropriations for defense, an immediate buildup of the army, and a Navy, quote, second to none. Truman, by the way, was also outraged by the America First Committee, and in particular, Charles Lindbergh. And in November, he wrote, November 11th, Veterans Day, 39, he wrote a letter to Bess in which he said, Harry Truman said, you know, it makes some of us who went on that first crusade, meaning the First World War, wonder sometimes just what fate really holds for civilization. So he was very much in favor of support for Britain, France, American allies. And on this, regardless of what FDR was doing in terms of his political career, he was totally backing the White House. You see again this card, vote for Senator Harry Truman for re-election. The people of Missouri should not be deprived of his 6 years experience in the US Senate. That's not the greatest political slogan I've ever seen. And his political promises have been fulfilled. Regardless of what he did, and no matter how hard he campaigned, and Truman was a dawn to dusk campaigner, tireless campaigner. Polls were still bad. Polls were showing that he was running not first, not second, but third in the race for this U.S. Senate 1940 in the Democratic primary. In fact, money was so low, campaign contributions were so meager that at one time, and during the early part of 1940, there wasn't enough money for Truman to get a hotel room when he was on the road campaigning in Missouri, so he slept in his car. Imagine a U.S. Senator sleeping in his car. Cartoon of the time, you see Stark and Truman, the Senate race, taking the gloves off, and you can read it for yourself, the betting odds, the polls, expert opinions, all which were that Stark was a shoo-in. In this perilous time, and by the way, I much like 34, this is a 3-person race. There's Truman, there's Stark, and there's Maurice Milliken, who happens to be the prosecutor, the U.S. attorney who had put Pendergast in prison. So you have that. Jimmy Burns, Senator Jimmy Burns of South Carolina, was one of the senators who wanted to help his friend Harry Truman. He knew that his campaign was in deep trouble, and he went to New York financier Bernard Baruch. I think you all know Bernard Baruch, and got him to give a campaign contribution of $4,000 to the campaign. Not a lot of money, but coming from Bernard Baruch, it helped get some other contributions. Alvin Barkley, the Senate Majority Leader. Alvin Barkley also agreed that later in the campaign, late in the primary, he would come to Missouri and give speeches for Truman in St. Louis and in Kansas City. By the way, Alvin Barkley is a name you'll want to remember, because in 1949, he'll become President Truman's vice president. Missouri's senior senator, of course, Bennett Clark, seemed determined to do nothing, or if anything, as he made very obvious, to support Governor Clark against Truman. Now, another sign of Truman's evolution, it comes during this campaign. Let's be candid. He was a man of his times. Privately, he still used the N-word when referring to African Americans, not uncommon in Missouri. He still enjoyed racial stereotype jokes when they were told in the Senate cloakroom, that kind of thing. But you begin to see a change in Truman. And in the summer of 1940, he did speak in Chicago to the National Colored Democratic Association Convention. And yes, it's one thing to have done that. That's nice. He said all the right things. He talked about racial equality to a Black audience. You might say, that's nice. So what? But he did more than that. He went to Sedalia in his re-election campaign. He received constituents, voters outside of the Truman state headquarters This is in Sedalia. This is 1940. And Truman went to give a major speech there in his re-election campaign. And his audience, as you can see from this photograph, was nearly all white, nearly all men. It's 1940. I think Missouri, I think we can kind of guess their views towards civil rights. And Truman got up and said to them, quote, "I believe in the brotherhood of man, not merely the brotherhood of white men, but a brotherhood of all men before the law. If any class or race can be permanently set apart from or pushed down below the rest in political and civil rights, so many of any other class or race, when it shall occur, the displeasure of its more powerful associates, and we may say farewell to the principles on which we count our safety." Now, again, Truman was never much of a speech maker, and this is rather convoluted, but then he ends by saying, "The majority of our Negro people find but cold comfort in shanties and tenements. Surely, as free men, they are entitled to something better than this." Now, he wasn't Malcolm X, but they may have thought he was when he gave that speech in Sedalia. That's a pretty gutsy speech for a guy who is in a brutal Senate race to stake out that position to a white audience in Sedalia. As the primary approached, good and bad, still Truman was being far outraised in campaign contributions by Governor Stark. It now clearly seemed to be a Stark-Truman race, actually a Stark-Milliken race. Truman is still probably running third late in the primary. In July, Stark made a big mistake. And this is what Truman was hoping for, that along the way, Stark's ego would get in his way. Not yet the winner of the Democratic Senate primary and the outgoing governor of Missouri at the end of the year, Stark went to the Democratic National Convention in July, and he announced for vice president. FDR was going to be the nominee. He had thrown open, more or less, the convention to pick his running mate, who would eventually be Henry Wallace. But Stark, who wanted to be president, thought, this is my opportunity to be vice president. So he campaigned openly for vice president in July at the National Convention. By the way, it wasn't impossible. He did wind up getting 200 delegate votes on the first ballot for vice president. But the reaction in Missouri, among Missouri Democrats, our governor, not yet even a guy who's won the primary, is already campaigning for vice president. In effect, he's running for two offices at one time while holding a third. And that, with the voters, did not go over well. It was a disastrous mistake. Now, on the other hand, Truman still struggled to the very end. In the primaries in August the 6th, in late July, as promised, Senate Majority Leader Alvin Barkley came to Missouri for the big endorsement, gave the big speeches endorsing Truman, both in an auditorium in St. Louis and an auditorium in Kansas City. It was a fiasco. Each hall held about, well, in St. Louis is a good example. The hall could hold 3,000 people. 300 showed up. Same was true in Kansas City. On the other hand, at the 11th hour, from the unlikeliest of sources, Truman got another unexpected assist from, of all people, Senator Bennett Clark, his old adversary, who now had been greatly offended by Governor Stark's attempt to become FDR's running mate for vice president. And in fact, I had also begun to see that, well, it's possible that my colleague, Harry Truman, he might be getting closer to Stark. So he switched sides and began to actively campaign in the closing weeks for Truman. Truman was flabbergasted, but was more than happy to take it. Here was a strong Pendergast critic, someone who had eviscerated him in speeches in 1934, now suddenly late in the primary, actually switching sides and supporting Truman. Nonetheless, on election night, August 6, 1940, Truman was heard to remark, well, I guess this time I'm beaten. And by 11 o'clock in the evening, he was still trailing Stark by 11,000 votes. But then the tide turned. More votes came in. The votes from Kansas City were not what Truman was used to, not what he had received 6 years earlier. But even in its shambles state, Jim Pendergast had rallied enough of the old organization that Truman did carry Kansas City by a respectable margin. He also shocked everybody by nearly carrying St. Louis. He did better than he had 6 years earlier with the farm vote. And he did very well with the African-American vote, such as it was. So on election night, this is Truman campaigning with Margaret and Bess. On election night, this is Truman on primary election night, August 6, 1940. Truman won by the narrowest of margins. Out of 665,000 votes cast, he won by not quite 8,000. 8,000 out of 665,000. Most importantly, he won. And he would go on to win the general election as well. Again, fairly close, but not nearly as close as the primary. 3 days after the primary in August, 3 days later, Senator Truman walks into the Senate chamber. And here was the sight that you couldn't have imagined when he first walked in 1935. He was rushed by his colleagues, Democrats and Republicans alike. They couldn't wait to pat him on the back, congratulate him. Harry, we were with you all the way, as you do in politics. And he said it was one of the most exciting moments of his political career. In the general election, as I say, FDR for president, Truman for senator, and he did well. He didn't do as well as FDR did, much better than Truman in 1940 with Henry Wallace as his running mate, but Truman still carried the state by 44,000 votes, which was respectable, and won his second term. Which brings me in the last 10 minutes to the last thing I want to emphasize. Secure in a second term, now no longer being called the senator from Pendergast, Truman reverted to a practice he had first started way back when he was a judge in the 1920s. Truman was very cost conscious. With the taxpayer's dollar as a judge, he actually had been very straightforward, very open. He had traveled all over the place, other states, to get to look at when he wanted to build a city hall, for example, which Kansas City badly needed. He went to other city halls around the country to see what they had done, how much it had cost, who were the good contractors. He began letting contracts to people who had no connection with Pendergast, this sort of thing. Well, Truman begins to do the same kind of thing after his reelection in 1940. He's concerned about reports that the construction of Fort Leonard Wood in central Missouri is not going well, that it's filled with cost overruns, gross extravagance, profiteering in construction, and he decides to personally investigate. So in the time between his reelection and when Congress comes back in 1941, and even beyond that, Truman gets in his old Dodge and begins to travel around to look at defense plants and military installations and to check up on defense contracts. He's a sitting senator. He gets access pretty much wherever he goes. He travels in his Dodge down to Florida. He goes up to Michigan. He travels over Missouri and everywhere, stopping at Army installations, defense plants. All in all, in this period, he travels about 10,000 miles, 10,000 miles in his beat up Dodge. And he discovered, to his disgust, that millions of dollars of taxpayer dollars are being squandered, that there's what we would call war profiteering going on. He's outraged, and he's outraged both at what he calls big business and what he calls big labor. He prepares weeks after his trips and his inspections, preparing his remarks, talking to his Senate colleagues, and he even meets with the president and tells him his concerns about cost overruns and shoddy construction and war profiteering. And as he would say, and the president now is reelected Senator Truman. He's pleasant to him. He even calls him Harry, something he had never done before. But he's vague about how much he's concerned about what Truman is telling him. So on February the 10th, 1941, Truman takes to the floor of the Senate and he calls for the establishment of a special committee, a bipartisan special committee of the Senate, to look into the awarding of defense contracts. It gets a strong reception. The special committee is formed. It will forever be known as the Truman Committee. And historian and biographer of Truman, David McCulloch, I think, puts it perfectly about Harry Truman, his leadership on investigating defense contracts, and the Truman Committee. McCulloch wrote, "It was his own idea, his own moment. Harry Truman's obscurity in national life and the course of the war was about to end." The Truman Committee would go on to uncover numerous scandals and war profiteering, which, by the way, made irresistible copy for newspapers and radio newscasts around the country. Among those the Truman Committee investigated and exposed as engaging in improper, even illegal activities were Alcoa, Standard Oil of New Jersey, General Motors, and Sidney Hillman of the Amalgamated Clothing Workers. So again, business and labor were not exempt. And the Truman Committee was no witch hunt. Even FDR would come to champion it in time, and it continued over the next 3 years, for the course of the war, really. In all, the Truman Committee issued over 50 well-researched committee reports on its examination of defense contracts, and its recommendations. the Truman Committee held over 400 hearings, and they heard from 1,798 witnesses. This became a serious. This is Truman with members of the Truman Committee, some of the members in his office. This is 1943. And I think in many ways, yes, the Truman Committee was a success. Yes, it saved the taxpayers millions of dollars. Yes, it did help to combat war profiteering. All those things are true. But I think the most amazing thing about the Truman Committee is that he had a rule. All committee reports had to be unanimous. Unanimous. Every Democrat, every Republican on the committee had to support the conclusions of their investigations and their reports, or they were not issued. How could this happen, you might say today? At the time, Republican Senator Owen Brewster, who was on the Truman Committee, said, you know, it's not hard to get people to agree when the facts are known. If only, huh? If only. Even in the Senate, where he'd gone from almost a pariah to being well-liked, Truman now received in these years a new stature. The more liberal Democratic and Republican senators, and yes, there were liberal Republicans back then, many of whom had detested Truman when he first came to the Senate, now came to regard him as not just pleasant or conscientious, but kind of bland, but as a real, as a figure, as a senator to be respected. And in effect, he had taken on what we would come to call the military industrial complex in an effective and a remarkably nonpartisan way. And in the course of it, had become a national figure. Almost done, 2 minutes. I know we have the Tiger game. March 8th, 1943. By another picture of the Truman Committee. This is also, I think, 1943, hearing from a witness. Of course, there's Harry in the center. March 8th, 43. You can't read it well, but Harry Truman appears on the cover of Time magazine for the first time. That line below says, Investigator Truman. And the article is remarkable. In many ways, remember, Time is, this is Henry Luce's newspaper. This is a magazine, pardon me. This is a Republican-leaning publication. It said in the article that the Truman Committee was, quote, the watchdog, the spotlight, the conscience, and the spark plug to the economic war behind the lines, and a heartening sign that even wartime democracy could keep an eye on itself. Even less remarkable, said this article in Time magazine in 43, was the transformation of Harry Truman from a Pendergast errand boy to an able, energetic committee chairman, just when he was needed most. And then Time article concludes, for a congressional committee to be considered the first line of defense, especially in a nation which does not tend to admire its representatives in Congress assembled, is encouraging to believers in democracy. So is the sudden emergence of Harry Truman, whose presence in the Senate is a queer accident of history. There was a poll conducted in 1944 by Look magazine, and they were of Washington reporters, Washington correspondents from papers around the country. And they named the 10 men, as it turned out, the 10 men most whose services had been were most important to the war effort. One of the 10 Look magazine named was Senator Harry Truman. And in fact, of the 10 on the list, he was the only member of the House or the Senate who made that list. With that, we're at noon, and you might say the rest is history. Despite being a senator with a bleak chance for re-election in 1940 and no public support from the president, 4 years later, we'll see, as you see in this picture, Harry Truman, now the Democratic nominee for vice president with FDR, and about to be elected to the vice presidency. And of course, we know the rest of the story. So in spite of everything, we got through it. I did not take a break because our usual 10-minute break we took at the beginning today. And with that, I'm going to wind it up. Go Tigers. And if I don't get a chance, we'll take questions if you hang around. If you don't, I understand. But let me wish everybody, on behalf of Pat and myself, let me wish everybody a happy Thanksgiving, Merry Christmas, Happy Hanukkah, Happy Kwanzaa, Happy New Year, happy everything. And I value your friendship and your interest in history more than I can express. I always give you a book recommendation. This is the one I'm recommending. David McCulloch's masterpiece, A Biography of Harry Truman. It was written several years ago, but it is still the definitive Truman biography. And again, it's pretty balanced. It's warts and all, good points, bad points. Truman by David McCulloch is the book I'd recommend. And yes, it is 1,000 pages, but it's a good 1,000 pages. Okay, with that, let me stop. And if you will if you're going to the Tiger game, I certainly understand. I'm wearing my orange, and Pat is too. If you're staying on, and again, this will be on YouTube shortly, be happy to take any questions, comments, critiques. Please unmute so we can hear you.
Question,
Yes, Don.
will you be doing
Don,
the
could
rest
you
of his?
Yes.
I'm sorry? Yeah, I'm off of mute. Can you hear me?
Don, I'm not here. Could you hit the there you go.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Here we go again.
Here we go again. I'm not hearing Don or anyone. I'm seeing mouths moving. I'm seeing great faces, but I'm not hearing. Let's see if we can do anything here. Pat, are we unmuted on this end?
Yeah.
Again, we're really going to look forward to being back together. Hopefully in January.
Why don't you put questions in the chat room?
Okay. For those of you who know how, why don't you put questions in the chat room? Do you know how to do that? I know several of you do. And I could read them from there. And Don, I'm sorry, I don't know why we're not getting, but this is kind of where we started today.
Hey, by the way, oh. No, that's me in the other room. You're unmuted. By the way, Jim's laptop is 7 years old.
Yes.
Guess what he's going to get for Christmas?
No, for Christmas, we're sending Pat to Phoenix to be with her daughter and granddaughter. But it's a good idea.
See, now, Miriam,
Miriam, I can see you, you're talking. Are you unmuted? Miriam, are you Marianne? I'm sorry, Marianne, are you unmuted? And Don, I know you know how to unmute, so it's not your fault. And on this end, we're unmuted. I know, Don, you can also send messages because you did one today.
I did.
Will you be covering the remainder of Truman's presidency January meeting?
Oh, okay, text from Don. Will you be covering the remainder of Truman's presidency at our January meeting? Yes, yes, definitely. I just thought today was important. I hope you did too, that you need to know what made him tick. And now we can get into the decision to use the atomic bomb, Hiroshima, Nagasaki. We can get into the Marshall Plan, NATO, the beginning of the Cold War with the Soviet Union. Of course, later the Korean War in 1950. I think all that is more easy to understand if you know more about the man who's making the calls. And as Harry, he had that famous sign on his desk, "The buck stops here." And that's where that phrase comes from. And yeah, he was the decision maker on the big moments. More questions? Or you can call Don and he can type this. He can type the questions. Okay. I have not seen any further. So I kind of suspect the Tiger game is superseded anything I could possibly say. So let's wrap this up.
See you next year.
Again, best wishes for the holidays. See you next year, and see you in person with any kind of luck in January. Okay, happy holidays.
Bye-bye.